friends, today I'm going to be talking about all of my favorite books of last year, 2024. I have a lot of books to get through because I don't do star ratings or rankings or anything like that, so I'm just going to be talking about all of the books that I enjoyed the most. So I am going to be categorizing them, so you can either just settle in and enjoy, or you can use the timestamps to jump around. My brain really loves to categorize, so I am going to divide the books into genres. So I'm going to have fiction, and then within that there's going to be some literary fiction and some historical fiction. Then classics, and that's going to include some modern classics. And then nonfiction, so some general nonfiction, and then also a biography and a memoir. And then after that I'm going to include some extra categories, just fun ones, like favorite rereads, surprise favorites, and also potential new favorite authors as well. But I'm going to start with the fiction, and I will say for the 5 books that I have under fiction, I have talked about these and other books that I'm going to be talking about already in my mid-year check-in favorite books of the year so far video that I did halfway through the year. And I still pretty much agree with everything that I said in that video. But I still wanted to include the books in this one just to have all of them in one place for the year. But I am going to try to be a little bit brief with the books that I know I've been talking about quite a bit in the year. So if you do want to just hear more about certain books, I am going to include that video up in the cards if you want to check it out. But yes, so let's get started. I'm going to start with Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Au, and this was actually the first book that I finished last year, which it is nice if you manage to start out the year with something that you end up really enjoying, and that was the case for me with this book. So this is a very slow, quiet, contemplative book about a mother and a daughter as they are traveling through Japan, and it's really about their attempt to communicate and connect with each other, and you know how that can be kind of difficult. And we get to hear from the point of view of the daughter, and she kind of ruminates a lot on life, family, memory, and also art. And it's quite short, so really nice to read in just like a day or two if you'd like to. That's always nice. I'm always considering rereading this because it's so short, and I just found it a little bittersweet, but very enjoyable. Next, I have A Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, and this one's translated by Polly Barton. And this one follows a housewife in the 90s in Japan. And it's again one of those more quiet kind of books, but this one is in a stream of consciousness style. And so we are in Natsumi's head, very much listening to her sort of running thoughts. So we really get to know her through these everyday sort of thoughts about domestic concerns and activities. We get to kind of see her insecurities and her grievances, while also having a very strong sort of sense of ambivalence about it all. And I just found that kind of relatable in that, you know, it's all these small things that sort of chip away at you, and you kind of, they add up to this general sense of unhappiness, but it's so dispersed in all these small things so that it feels like you wouldn't be able to pinpoint one thing that you could necessarily change to improve all of it. And I just find that, again, just relatable and just kind of interesting. Just the way that you can sometimes feel unhappy and you want to maybe be happier or improve things, but then it might be sometimes hard to muster up the will to actually make a change. So it's a very subtle book. Not a lot happens in it. So it's definitely for those of us that enjoy just getting to know the inner workings of a character really well. The next book is one that I am still not sure why I don't have a physical copy of, and it's Eileen by Otessa Moshfegh. And this follows a young woman named Eileen who is very unhappy. She lives with her alcoholic father and works at this teen correctional facility, and everything changes for her when this very attractive woman starts working at the same facility. The narration is first person from Eileen's point of view, but as a much older woman, and her kind of tone is very judgmental of her younger self, and she's addressing the reader, telling you the story of what finally caused her to change, because at the beginning of the story, Eileen is very unhappy, and you really get to understand why. Like, she's justified in being pretty unhappy, but she's very unwilling to change. And so the story really is about what finally happened that made her really inevitably have to make a change in her life. And the twist in this is very dramatic, but for me, the thing that I enjoy most about this book, the strength of it, it really is that character study of Eileen. She's a very interesting, complex character that feels very believable. And, you know, I think she's considered unlikable, but I find her just very compelling and very human. Next is a historical fiction, and it is West by Carys Davies. And this one follows a widowed father and a daughter in settler times in the US. And the story begins with the father leaving to explore the West because he thinks that he can go find mammoths in the West, because at this time they hadn't finished exploring all of the Western United States. And so he just feels this very strong calling to go do this. Like, it's going to be like his life's achievement or something like that. And so the book follows him on his journey trying to find these giant beasts. And on the other side, it follows his daughter and what his leaving means for her story, what happens to her. It's really both of them having to deal with the consequences of him choosing to do this and leaving. And it's a very short book, so I won't give much away, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was just a very beautifully told allegory. Next is The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore. And this one focuses on a real person in history called Tarare in France, who became infamous for having both the need and ability to eat very large amounts of food, including eating things that are not edible, live animals, and all kinds of gross things. And there's not a lot that's really known as fact about him. And so this book does a really great job of really humanizing him and also giving him a story that feels plausible, because so much of what is sort of survives or is known about him sounds like fiction. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. And it just really tells his story in a really beautiful way. Something that I think is done very effectively in this is that there are both very beautiful descriptions and sort of beautiful moments, while also having very grotesque descriptions and very grotesque things happening at times. It really balances those things really well. And then the author is also a poet, so there's just some really beautiful writing in this. Next, I have classics, and the first one that I'm going to talk about is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And I actually listened to this one on audio because this one is in the stream of consciousness style, and I tried reading it before and I had a little bit of a hard time getting into it, and I feel like the audiobook really helped me get the rhythm of it. So I do recommend that if you would like to try the audiobook. I think it's a really great way to go. So this book takes place all in one day, and we start out with Mrs. Dalloway as she makes her way to buy some flowers for a party that she will be having later that day. And the storytelling in this is really interesting because we start out following Mrs. Dalloway, but the narration of this sort of jumps around between different people's sort of consciousness. And so we start out moving with her, but as she's moving through the city, doing her thing, we kind of start jumping onto other people and sort of following other people and make our way around. And in that way, we kind of get to know from different perspectives. We get to hear from people of different ages, different socioeconomic statuses, and so it gives you a really interesting sense of different people's perspectives, but it also gives you a sense of the country during this time period, very transitional time period. I believe it was around the turn of the century. And so it does so much in such a condensed form. And towards the end of the book, we circle back to Mrs. Dalloway, now with her party underway. And it really ends up feeling like this book just celebrates life, all of like its complexities and ups and downs, possibilities, and opportunities. So I ended up really enjoying it this time around. And I'm very interested in trying some more of Virginia Woolf's fiction, just to see if they end up working as well for me as this did. Next I have As I Lay Dying by Faulkner, and this was one of my introductions to the Southern Gothic genre this year, which I ended up really enjoying. I think the writing style in this might not be for everyone, but it ended up really working for me. So this follows a family where the matriarch has just died, and they are trying to transport her body back to her hometown where she wanted to be buried. That was one of her kind of dying wishes. And it's really the story of what happens as they're trying to do this. It really is a difficult task, a bit of an odyssey. And each chapter is told from a different perspective, mostly from the different family members, but then also some neighbors and kind of acquaintances of theirs. And each chapter sounds very individual to each character, which I really enjoyed. So kind of going back to the idea of style, some of the writing, especially for some of the characters, is more kind of abstract and opaque. And it really fits the character. And I ended up really enjoying it because it just kind of invites you to bring your own interpretation, which I just thought was really fun. And humor doesn't always work for me in books, but the kind of dark, ironic humor in this really did work for me, which is interesting because I read this as part of a readathon for Faulkner in August, and some people in the group didn't read it with any kind of humor at all, which is always interesting. You always bring your own perception and experience to things like that, you know, your own interpretation. But I definitely saw some very dark humor and irony in this, and I ended up enjoying that. So yeah. Next is Beloved by Toni Morrison, and this is the story of a woman who escapes slavery. It's about the things that she had to do in order to do that, and also the ways in which her past experiences continue to haunt and affect her and her family after she has gained her freedom. And it's a very difficult story, but it's really beautifully told. And it's about many things, including the legacy of slavery and also what happens when you really push love to its limit. And I am being really brief, so if you do want to hear me talk in more detail about this, I'm going to link a video where I talk more about it, so you can check that out if you would like to. Next, I have War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and I actually read this, I did a slow read of this last year, so I read it throughout the entire year, and I ended up loving doing that. So if you are someone that would like to read this book, but you're very intimidated by the length, I do highly recommend doing that because I found the pacing very easy. I read 1 or 2 chapters most weekdays, and I found that very easy. It just became part of my morning routine. I would read while I had breakfast, and it made it very enjoyable. And I even fell behind by quite a bit towards the end of the year, and I still found it very easy to catch up again before the year was up. So yeah, do highly recommend the slow read for this book. So this book focuses on a number of different characters that we get to know as they are living their lives through the Napoleonic Wars in Russia. And like Mrs. Dalloway, it is a book about life, and so we get to see characters in very different circumstances, different sort of age groups, and I think we get to see like every possible emotion a human can experience. Definitely some characters are meant to represent sort of different facets of life and different aims. But they're all very real, fallible people. They don't feel like simplified symbols or cartoons. They all have ups and downs, and they all have personal growth because they all go through difficult things that they experience that make them grow and change over time. And I read this loosely following Simon Hasel's, I don't know if I'm saying his last name right, but he has book guides on Substack for free, and this is one of them. And I found it very helpful. You don't have to follow the guide closely, but he has some really helpful resources. So I am going to link to it if you want to find out more. And one of the resources that I found very helpful is the character list, because there are a lot of characters in this. And his list made it very easy to reference it, especially towards the beginning of the book when I was still getting familiar with the characters. It helped a lot. So even if you don't want to follow the guide, I do recommend that resource in particular, because you can just bookmark it and refer to it when you need to. So one thing that I haven't noticed other people mention specifically, or maybe I just ignored it, I don't really know. But one thing that I didn't know about this book is that there is a ton of criticism in this book. Tolstoy talks a lot about historians and how they document and characterize history and historical figures. And there's also a lot of philosophizing about what brings about wars, if it's an individual or if it's what moves nations or people. Is it inevitable? And I mean, I understand that writers at this time, Tolstoy was seen as an intellectual, and he was looked to for his opinion on things like this, you know, for I don't know, people to shape their ideas. But it was endless, and just, I don't know, as a modern reader, it got old really fast. I just personally am not invested in those kinds of opinions. I just kept feeling like, where are my characters? I want to know what happens to my characters. So I don't know. On a reread, I will probably skip those parts specifically. But I do want to say, I'm not talking about the war parts in general. The war parts that are part of the story are actually really good. A lot of them are very interesting. A lot of them are a lot more peaceful than the parts that are, you know, not focusing on the military. But overall, I just really, really enjoyed this. You really get attached to a small number of characters, because even though it starts out with a lot of characters, it really ends up focusing on a very small number, and it's very manageable, especially if you use that list. And I ended up really enjoying it. It really is a great book. You know, it's up to you what you want to skip or not skip, but I do think it's worthwhile for the true fiction parts in this. And the last classic I have to talk to you about is Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. And this was one that I definitely read towards the later part of the year, and I ended up loving. So it does have some recency bias, but it is definitely just a new favorite overall. So this follows a young man who promises his mother on her deathbed to go meet his father in her hometown after she dies. And this is the story of what happens when he does that, what he discovers when he gets there. And one thing that I just really loved in this was the storytelling. You do have to be like a little patient with it, because when he gets to this town, he eventually understands that it is a ghost town. And in this very foggy kind of way, you start to understand what the story of the town is. You start to learn its secrets, and to understand its history in relation to the young man's father as well. And so he can't distinguish between when he is seeing and hearing real people and when it's ghosts. And so there's this kind of slight opaqueness to the writing that really kind of mimics his experience for you as the reader. And so if you manage to be patient and just let things sort of slowly roll out, the story really reveals its kind of secrets and answers to you as you go. It is a bit dark and grim, but in a very kind of whimsical way, which I ended up really enjoying. And it's definitely the kind of book that's meant to be read more than once, because on a reread, you'll definitely catch things that you probably missed the first time around. And with it being so short, it makes it, you know, just easy to do that. We're going to move on to nonfiction now, and I'm going to start with Ways of Seeing by John Berger. And this book came out in 1972 and is still very relevant today. So this is all about the way we look at media. And so it starts out by talking about the way we look at classic art, and then from there sort of eventually transition into talking about how that informs media and marketing today. So you don't need to be big into art to find this relevant. It really talks about how we all have kind of cultural biases, assumptions, and associations that we all carry subconsciously, and he uses he kind of breaks them down by explaining how we tend to view classic art and explaining how that comes from how classic art was made and for the purpose that it was made. And the reason that it's important to become more consciously aware of these things within ourselves, more consciously, is so that we are not being blindly manipulated by media and marketing. So it's really cool. It's actually really digestible and not very long. So yeah, I love this. Next I have This Little Art by Kate Briggs, and this book is about translation. She is a translator herself. She translates from French to English, and in this she really talks about a lot of things to do with translation. She talks about her own experiences translating and why she loves it so much. You really get a sense of her love of language and communication. And she also talks about other writers and their relationships with their translators. And it's just really beautifully done. I really enjoyed it. It's not super short, but I was just really hooked. So yeah, very detailed and immersive. Next is The Art of Libromancy by Josh Cook. And this is a book that I actually haven't talked about yet on my channel, so I might take a little extra time to talk about it here. So Josh Cook is a bookseller and co-owner of Porter Square Books in Massachusetts, and they have 2 locations now, I think. They're an independent bookstore that is employee owned, and they have a cult following online, so I am going to link their Instagram if you want to check it out. So this is an essay collection on bookselling, so very appropriate if you would like to become a bookseller or if you would like to open an indie bookstore. But I think also really interesting if you're just a lover of books like me, and especially if you're interested in supporting and learning more about independent bookstores. So this kind of really pulls back the curtain on bookstores, bookselling, and the publishing industry as well, in a very digestible kind of way. It goes into some interesting details about the differences between independent and non-independent bookstores, the different sort of business models you can have for independent bookstores. You know, so there's some technical information in here for people running independent bookstores, but it's not just for that. It is not a handbook for starting an indie bookstore. So it really does have some very fun information for people who also just want to learn more about indie bookstores. So for example, I really enjoyed that it goes into the thinking behind how you might organize books within the bookstore, and where you place books, how many of them, and obviously if you want to make money, you'll probably put a lot of new releases towards the front of the store, but you might also make some room for some lesser known books that you would like to highlight and things like that. Josh Cook also has a reputation for being kind of really good at recommending books in a personalized way, and so he also talks about the difference between, you know, informing people so that they can make choices for themselves versus pushing books where you're just telling people what they should be reading. I also found it very interesting that he goes quite a bit into ethics in bookselling and publishing, so stalking problematic authors or books, or hosting them for talks and things like that, or stalking books that don't align with your own views or politics, and you know, different ways that you can deal with that. There's also a chapter where he talks about how they managed to, you know, get through the pandemic years at Porter Square Books and the things that have changed for them because of that, the way they run things. And one of my favorite essays in here is all about how to read experimental works of literature in translation that you think are too difficult for you. I ended up really enjoying that. He just has practical information for that, and I thought that was really fun. Next is Invitation to a Banquet by Fuchsia Dunlop. And she is actually a food writer and cookbook author that specializes in Chinese cuisine. And so this book is about Chinese cuisine and its history. And it's divided into chapters where each chapter centers around a particular dish. And then that serves as a vehicle to talk about Chinese culinary history. And so she will talk about the region that the dish is from and the ingredients. And she always includes personal experiences of visiting the region, trying the dishes, seeing where the ingredients are grown, and talking to locals and professionals. And it's just very thorough and very detailed. And it talks about a lot of aspects of cuisine, including techniques and things like that, but also culture. And so I just felt like I learned a lot, and I ended up really enjoying it. Next is The Grand Affair by Paul Fisher, and this is a biography of John Singer Sargent, who was a very successful painter in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he's probably most well known for his very lifelike portraits of high society at the time. And I was particularly interested in this biography because I am a huge Sargent fan, but not a lot is known about his personal life, his private life. But I feel like the author in this managed to really put together a very detailed biography of his life. He really takes his time with his childhood and upbringing. So I ended up really enjoying that because it really informs a lot of what you see in his art. And it was an unusual upbringing because he was the child of American expats living in Europe. And you can really see how that ended up really shaping his life and his work. If you are interested in John Singer Sargent, I do think this is a really great biography. Next, I have Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doughty. And Caitlin Doughty is a mortician. And this memoir talks about the kind of events and circumstances that got her interested in death and funeral practices. It talks about how she started working in a crematorium, and that was kind of her way into the industry itself. And in this, she really talks about how it is that she discovered that she really wanted to help people have a better relationship with death and mortality, and also offering different options for funeral and ritual options than what is currently available, because a lot of those are not always satisfying or helpful because they just really encourage a large amount of distance and mystery around death. And also, you know, these practices were invented really for profit rather than with people in mind. And so you really do get to learn how cremation and embalming work, how those methods were created. And it also dispels a lot of kind of myths and assumptions that we tend to have about death and corpses. And I know that reading about death can seem like a very macabre thing to do, but this book is so like humanistic and compassionate, and it also manages to really kind of balance a subject that can seem kind of grim with a lot of humor. So it just does it really, really well. And so while this is very much about her personal journey in relation to the subject of death and the funeral industry, and she does share some very personal experiences, I do feel like this memoir is a lot more about the subject than it is about the author. A lot of the memoirs I read are very much about the person themselves, and I feel like while this does balance that really well, I do think that the objective of this memoir is a lot more about teaching you about the subject than it is about the person. And that works out really, really well. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot from it. I learned that this is something that I care about, which was really, really cool. So we're going to move on to some fun categories now, and the first one is surprise favorites. So these are books that I kind of picked up on a whim, without expectations, and ended up being surprised by how much I enjoyed them. So the first book is The Pillow Book by Say Shonigan, and this is nonfiction. It is a collection of observations and musings, lists, and poems by a court lady in Japan in the year 1000, around the year 1000. So I just assumed that I just wouldn't find it very interesting, that I wouldn't relate to it because it's just so long ago. But I actually ended up really loving it because Shonigan's personality really comes through, and she's witty and smart and funny. She can be very gossipy and kind of vindictive. So I just really enjoyed her. And she's also just very like high-spirited. She can be kind of rash, and she kind of, and it's funny because you get the sense that she knows this, but she's just like, but that's just me. And so she'll do rash things that then come back to bite her, and she's like, so I really enjoyed learning about this time period, both from the intro, but also from the writing itself. You get a sense of what things were like, and kind of expectations and norms, and for court life at the time, which I just find so fascinating because I love social history, and yeah, honestly, seeing all the ways that people were constantly breaking the rules as well. That was super fun. So yeah, just a really unexpectedly fun read for me. Next is A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor, and this is actually an individual short story, and so you'll find it in collections with other short stories. But I just wanted to talk about this particular story on its own, because it was my other introduction to the Southern Gothic genre, and again, I ended up just really enjoying it. It left a big impression on me. And this is the story of a family, mom, dad, 2 kids, and grandma, traveling on a road trip while some runaway killers are on the loose. And this story just really packs a punch. You kind of get to know the different family members and their imperfections and very imperfect relationships with each other. You know, you get to see what happens to them. And this is not a horror book, but let's just say there's some harsh judgment passed. Next is A Spy in the House of Love by Anais Nin. And this was a surprise favorite for me because this centers a character that normally I wouldn't necessarily be interested in. This is all about Sabina, around 30-year-old woman who is married, and she says she is happy with her relationship and she is happy with the stability it provides. And this is written and set in the 50s, so she is meeting expectations for her time. But she also has a really insatiable need for excitement and self-fulfillment that she satisfies by having extramarital relationships. So the story is about an unfaithful woman, which normally wouldn't interest me, but it's just a very nuanced and interesting character study because of the constant push and pull that she experiences with you know, these 2 needs of wanting stability but also wanting excitement, and the inability to really balance her need for freedom with the mounting guilt that she does feel about lying to her husband. So we see her really struggle to be honest with herself and try to justify her actions and contradict herself, and she's just very human. And also it's very beautifully written, and it's also very short. So yeah, I just really ended up enjoying this kind of deep dive into a character that is very flawed, but also just really interesting and strong. And we're on to the last book in this category, and it is Between Two Fires by Christopher Beelman. And this was kind of my way of dipping my toes into fantasy, sort of, because this is medieval horror. So you have elements of horror, historical fiction, and also fantasy. And I just ended up really enjoying it. I just thought this was a lot of fun. And at the heart of it, it is a hero's journey to redemption with three unlikely friends coming together to fight demons. So we have a disgraced knight, a young witch, and a gay priest coming together in this story, which is set during the Black Plague in France. So there's a really fun use of biblical themes in this to kind of set the stage for the story. So at the beginning, you learn that God has abandoned the earth. And so fallen angels, demons, devils, I don't know, fallen angels, have decided to attack the earth as a last resort to get God's attention. And then this correlates with the Black Plague. And there's adventure and really fun dialogue. I personally just thought it was a very fun book. Even though it has the biblical themes, they're more like motifs, I thought, than necessarily indicating like a very strong moral or religious message in this. Think more the band Ghost, though less campy than, reading a sermon or something like that. The next category is right place and right time. And this category is for books that I know I would have enjoyed regardless, but having read them at the right moment, in the right sort of mindset, made me enjoy them even more than I might have otherwise. And the two books that I'm going to talk about, I actually read one after the other, and so in my mind I kind of associate them together because of my experience with them. And the first one is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. So this follows a World War I veteran who is traveling to the north of England to work on restoring a mural in a church. So this month that he is spending working on this mural really gives him kind of a break so that he can, try to put his life back together. He's had it rough in his, I think, mid-20s with PTSD and a failed marriage, and so this time really gives him the opportunity to try to heal and find some solace in the very tough but rewarding job that he is doing of restoring this mural, while also giving him this opportunity to find a sense of community when he starts to meet people in this little town. So it's a very quiet but really beautiful book, and there's also some kind of dry humor in it that really adds some levity. And the next book is An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. So this one also follows a veteran in Japan after World War II. And I'm actually not sure if he's entirely considered a veteran. He helped with the war effort with his art. And we get to know about his background as a painter and how eventually he changed kind of the purpose of his work, because he really believed that, it was for something meaningful, that it was for the better of his country. And so with this change, he really rejected his earlier ideas that fueled his art. At the start of the book, it's only a few years after the end of World War II. It's, I think, 48 or something like that. And he's being described as aging. And so he was already well into his adulthood when he made this change. And at this point, he's really kind of having to reckon with how the world is changing around him quite a bit. And he really starts to consider whether he is proud of his achievements and what his life has been about, the choices he has made. And we see him really kind of start to doubt his choices, his past choices, because he perceives those around him starting to kind of judge him. But because he's also described as aging, it's a little bit unreliable, and that kind of, it makes it interesting for the reader to consider what you think is truly happening. So I really enjoyed kind of experiencing these books sort of alongside each other and seeing the connecting themes that they had going on. We've got two veterans dealing with themes of art and memory and loss in different ways. But we also get to see the two characters experience these things at different points in their life, very different ages. And that also makes a difference. So I ended up really, really enjoying that experience. And I actually maybe enjoyed it even more because I documented the whole thing. I have a vlog where I read through both of these, so I will put that up if you haven't seen it. But yeah, I really enjoyed the experience of reading these two books together. Next, I have my favorite rereads, and I have 2 books to share with you. So the first one is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and I read an annotated edition for the first time around, and I loved adding that to the experience. I definitely moved kind of slowly through it, but I just let myself do that because I just savored it so much. I love the writing. It's so witty and just wonderful. And it was really fun to kind of experience the story and the characters as an adult because I realized I hadn't read it since I was a teenager. And I feel like I just related to things in a different way, you know, just from having experienced a little bit more life. Yeah, I mean, I think to me this is just really a perfect novel. So that's all. And the second favorite reread was The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. And this was actually my first Ishiguro, so it was fun to revisit it. This follows a butler in, I think it's the 50s in England, and he's taking a road trip to the coast. And so this gives him a lot of time to kind of reminisce and think back on his life and really notice how much the world has changed around him and really come to terms with whether he has made the best choices, if he's happy with the choices he's made, and whether it's not too late to change for the better. And he's a very uptight kind of character, withholds a lot, which then makes it very interesting because it makes it very easy to read between the lines, which is something that I really enjoy in here. So it was interesting rereading this because it definitely didn't have the same kind of impact that it had for me the first time I read it. But if reading Pride and Prejudice was like visiting an old friend and making new memories, then rereading this was like visiting an old friend and reminiscing about old times, which, you know, it's just a different way of enjoying a book. So we're down to the last category, and it is potential new favorite authors. So I have 2 authors to talk about with 2 books for each author. And the first one is Rory Muir, who is a historian, and I read his books for Jane Austen July. So the first book is Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen. And like the title says, it really is all about love, relationship, marriages, courtship, sex, and all the norms and expectations associated with all of those things during the Regency period in England. And it also delves into exploring whether common assumptions that people tend to have about this time period are true, like whether most marriages were unhappy. And I just also really love the use of actual accounts from letters and diaries and things like that that are just kind of sprinkled around the book to really add a kind of, you know, that human element to it. Makes it very engaging in what is otherwise just a lot of information. And it also talks about just really interesting related things like divorces, elopements, same-sex couples, parenthood, remarriages, all of those kinds of things. And it's very thorough. There's a lot of information, but I really like how well Rory Muir manages to make it very engaging and readable. And then the second book that I read by him was Gentlemen of Uncertain Fortune, which is all about younger sons during the Regency period, because during this time, the oldest sons would inherit most of the family wealth, and then all of the other sons that came after would have to work. So this largely focuses on the limited career options that were available to younger sons if they still wanted to be considered part of the gentry. So this includes things like banking, law, medicine, the army, and the navy. And again, Rory Muir really, kind of balances a lot of information with some of those personal accounts, sometimes very heartwarming, and yeah, just makes it very engaging and readable. And the second potential new favorite author is Edith Wharton. And the first book I'm going to talk about is The House of Mirth, which follows Lily Bart, who is a young, but not so young for the time, young woman who is part of high society in New York in the 1990s. And she is well-born, but poor. And so this is all about her struggle to kind of keep her status and you know, be able to live within this high society full of luxury and expense without getting married, basically. And I just kind of love her. She is very flawed, but she's so headstrong and witty, and she just loves her independence. And so in some ways, she's definitely her own worst enemy. She kind of, you know, brings a lot of these things on herself by not being more responsible. But at the same time, she's very compelling because she is very limited by social expectations of the time. A very interesting and compelling story, I think. And the other book by Edith Wharton, the last book, is Summer. And this one is very different because this one has a rural setting. So this is a novella that follows a young girl who, at the beginning of the story, is adopted by one of the wealthiest men in this small town, a lawyer. And she comes from the mountain, which means that she comes from a very poor background. And this is her coming of age and sexual awakening. And it's very short, so I don't want to give too much away, but she grows up so much because she experiences so much in this summer of her life. So she goes from feeling kind of really bored and ambivalent to really experiencing a lot of hope and excitement and agency, you know, feeling like she's sort of tainted by her background, to then also considering if she actually cares about climbing a social ladder, and just really considering what kind of life she wants to lead. And she experiences love, but then also the realities of being in different social classes. And at the end of the book, she's in a very difficult situation. And the way that the choice she makes at the end of the book, I feel like is not ideal for like anybody. But I think it's a very interesting one. It just really leaves you thinking and considering, yeah, so many things. It's just a very complicated situation, but it's just very interesting. I appreciate the way that Edith Wharton really makes her characters live with the consequences of her actions. That's life. But it's funny because before I actually sat down and looked at the entire list, I had the sense that I hadn't had the best reading year. And I actually think it's because right at the beginning of last year, or towards the beginning of last year, I read a lot of books that I was really excited about that I ended up hating. And it put me in this position of feeling like, what even is my taste? Do I even know my taste? Oh my God. I had a little bit of a existential crisis about it. But then, you know, further on in the year, after starting my booktube channel, I had a much better time with my reading. And so I actually think I had a pretty good year, which, by the way, I'm not going to be talking about DNFs or disappointments in this video, but you can check out that mid-year check-in video if you do want to hear me talk about some of the books that I was most disappointed about. I just think I'm just still getting to know my taste in books and what I love the most, what I find exciting and want to continue to look for. So I'm very excited for my reading this year. And I also have some fun ideas for my reading plans and some kind of loose goals and things. So I'm thinking of making a reading plans for the year kind of video really soon. And I have lots of other ideas for videos as well. So yeah, I hope you're all having a really great start to your year, which I can't believe the first month is already almost over. But yes, do let me know maybe what your favorite book of the year was, or just what you're reading right now if you'd like. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye.